You find yourself sitting across from her, a glass of wine between you, her laughter curling in the air like smoke. Everything feels light, intoxicating until she says it. Just a casual sentence slipped in between stories about her college years. A reference to nights that sound wilder than you imagined. Names you do not know, but now cannot unhear. In an instant, the warmth in your chest turns cold. Your jaw tightens. Your mind begins to run a reel you did not ask for, a montage of images you cannot stop. You hear her voice, but the words now have a shadow under them. You nod, you smile, but beneath the table your hand clenches into a fist. Something deep, ancient, and ugly has awakened inside you. It is not logical. It is not fair. It is not even about her anymore. It is about something primal, coiled in the core of your being. Freud would have called this the return of the repressed, the eruption of a drive older than your conscious mind. He would not have shamed you for it. He would have studied it like a scientist staring at a fossil, knowing it is proof of forces that predate civilization. Sigmund Freud left men like you a warning that what we call jealousy or disgust in these moments is not simply personal insecurity. It is the unconscious mind colliding with the raw sexual history of another. And in that collision, the mask of polite modernity slips, revealing the animal beneath. You have been told by society that this reaction is toxic, fragile, immature. But Freud would tell you, it is a clue to the hidden architecture of your desires, your fears, and the unconscious contract you make when you imagine a woman as yours. The problem is not that this feeling exists. The problem is that you do not understand it. Without understanding, it will own you. It will drive you into weakness, into obsession, into the slow erosion of your dignity. But with understanding, this same force can be transformed into something far more dangerous: sovereignty over your own mind. This is the transformation Freud offers you, not to erase the instinct, but to master it. To become the kind of man who can stare into the raw, unvarnished truth of human sexuality and remain unmoved, unshaken, unbroken. To become untouchable. The thesis is brutal in its clarity. A woman's sexual past triggers a primal fear in men because it confronts them with the collapse of their unconscious fantasy of exclusivity. And until you dismantle that fantasy and rebuild it on a foundation of reality, you will remain a slave to a story you did not write. Now, let us dive into the scenarios where this primal fear emerges, not in theory, but in the living theater of attraction. Scenario 1, the offhand confession at dinner. Imagine you are in a candlelit restaurant. The lighting is warm, her perfume soft in the air. You are leaning forward, locked into a flow of conversation that feels effortless. Then, without malice, she mentions a wild summer in her early 20s. A few details, a few names, a laugh at her own recklessness. She does not elaborate, but your mind does the rest. The image of her in other men's arms blooms instantly. Your appetite is gone, replaced by a gnawing tension in your stomach. What she has just delivered is not an accident. Even if she is unaware of it, this is a test. Freud would say the unconscious communicates through slips and revelations, often revealing more than the conscious mind intends. On the surface, it is simply a story from her past. But beneath, it is a probe away to sense your internal architecture. Will you flinch? Will you tighten? Will you attempt to assert dominance? Or will you collapse into silent resentment? Her unconscious is gathering data about your strength, your security, and your ability to confront reality without shattering. This is not just about her past. It is about whether you can handle the truth of her humanity without losing your own equilibrium. The typical weak male response here is subtle but fatal. He stiffens, his laughter dies. His eyes dart downward as he processes the new information. He might try to cover it with a joke, but it lands flat. Or worse, he begins to interrogate, asking how many, Why turning the moment into an inquisition? Freud would say this is the eruption of the ego's defense mechanism's projection, rationalization trying to make sense of a wound to the masculine fantasy of being the sole object of her passion. But in doing so, the man exposes the wound itself. She sees it, she feels the shift, and instantly, attraction begins to decay. The air grows heavier. The magic of the evening is gone, replaced by the quiet throb of unspoken judgment. The power response in this scenario is the embodiment of psychological dominance. You do not flinch. You do not stiffen. You do not interrogate. You meet her revelation with the same unbroken presence you carried before it was spoken. Your eyes remain steady on hers, your breathing unaltered. You might smirk slightly, as though she has just given you an intriguing piece of information that amuses you more than it unsettles you. You let a pause hang in the air long enough to convey that you are processing it, but the pause does not carry judgment, only curiosity born of confidence. Then, you pivot the energy without announcing it. You take her story and redirect it into a conversation about the nature of desire, or about how people change with time, or perhaps into a flirtatious remark that implies you are more interested in the present than the past. Freud would see in this response the mastery of sublimation redirecting raw, potentially destabilizing emotional energy into a higher expression of self-control and playfulness. This is not denial. You have heard her, and she knows it. But you have also demonstrated that her past has no leverage over your emotional state. In that moment, you communicate two powerful subtexts: that you are a man anchored in the present, and that you are not naive about human nature. You strip the unconscious test of its teeth by showing that reality, in all its imperfections, is something you can absorb without collapsing. The philosophical alignment here is profound. Freud understood that repression leads to neurotic collapse. By acknowledging her humanity without moralizing it, you step outside the fragile frame of the possessive ego and into the frame of the sovereign observer. You become the man who can handle truth without retreating into fantasy. This is rare. She will feel it. The shift in her perception is almost immediate. First, there is the subtle widening of her eyes, her unconscious registering that her probe did not produce the expected crack in your armor. Instead of recoiling, you became more interesting. In the short term, this breeds intrigue. She wonders if you have experienced so much life that her story barely grazes your emotional surface, or if you are simply unshakable by nature. In the long term, this interaction plants a seed of respect. She begins to sense that you are not competing with her past lovers, because in your reality, there is no competition. You are the gravitational center of your own life. That sense of self-possession is intoxicating, and it pulls her deeper into your orbit. Scenario 2. The social media ghosts. It happens while you are lying in bed beside her. She has dozed off, her phone resting on the nightstand. A notification lights up the screen, a comment from a man you have never heard of. You click, and his profile shows old photos of him with her. You scroll further and find images of vacations, nights out, moments that look like they were charged with intimacy. She never mentioned him, but there he is, a ghost from her sexual past, alive in the digital shadows. The hidden test here is not deliberate, yet it is potent. Freud would argue that the unconscious never truly forgets, and in the digital age, neither does the internet. The presence of this man in her history forces your unconscious to confront two things at once. First, the reality that her sexual life predates you, and second, that it still exists in some archived form that you cannot erase. The psychological purpose of this test is not in her control, but your reaction will still define the power dynamic. The man who collapses here reveals that he is hostage to imagined rivals who no longer exist in reality, but live rent-free in his head. The weak response is a spiral. He starts scrolling obsessively, searching for more traces of her past. He feels a tightening in his chest, a mix of anger and inadequacy. He begins to subtly withdraw from her in the following days, his mind consumed by imagined comparisons. Perhaps he drops passive-aggressive remarks about her type, or about men from the past. Freud would say he has become the victim of displacement, directing his unprocessed anxiety toward her rather than confronting the deeper wound, the shattering of his exclusivity fantasy. This not only drains his emotional presence, but also signals to her that he is governed by insecurity, which will, over time, corrode her attraction. The power response begins with restraint. You do not touch the phone again. You recognize the surge of emotion as a primal reflex, not a truth about the present. You turn toward her sleeping form and allow the tension to dissipate through controlled breathing, grounding yourself in the reality that this ghost has no place in the life you are building with her unless you give it one. In the morning, you do not mention the man. You do not interrogate. You return to your role as the man she chose, anchored in the now. If she brings him up later, you receive the information with calm detachment, perhaps even with a light remark that signals your understanding that every person as past is littered with stories that do not define their present. In Freud's lens, this is the transformation of reaction into mastery. You are refusing to let the past hijack the present moment, channeling the energy of jealousy into the quiet reaffirmation of your current dominance in her life. The unconscious message you send her is this: I know there were others, and it changes nothing about my position in your world. This is a profound security one she will not easily forget. The shift in her perception is deep. She feels safer, paradoxically, not because you ignore reality, but because you face it without fear. This makes her past feel smaller in your presence, not because it is erased, but because it is irrelevant. She begins to view you as a man immune to ghosts, a man who cannot be pulled into the petty theater of jealousy. This immunity elevates you in her mind from a participant in her romantic life to the anchor around which it revolves. Scenario 3. The unexpected encounter. You are at a rooftop bar. The city lights flicker in the background. Music hums beneath the murmur of voices, and she is beside you, her hand lightly on your forearm. You are fully in the moment, until you notice her eyes shift. She sees someone across the room. Before you can ask, the man is walking over, smiling. He greets her by name with a familiarity that's more than casual. She introduces him as an old friend, but you hear the subtle shift in her tone. You shake his hand, but the grip is a fraction tighter than normal. In the next few minutes, the truth becomes clear not through words, but through the air between them. This is a man who has shared her in ways you never will. This is one of the most potent unconscious tests you will ever face. Freud would identify it as a direct confrontation between the ego ideal and reality. In your fantasy, you are the central, exclusive figure in her sexual narrative. In this moment, reality shatters that fantasy in real time. Not only are you confronted with her past, but the past is standing in front of you, breathing, smiling, existing. This is not a digital ghost, it is flesh and blood. The psychological purpose here, whether deliberate or not, is to reveal whether you can maintain frame when reality refuses to edit itself for your comfort. The weak male response here is written in micro-expressions. He becomes quieter. His gaze shifts from her to the man and back again. He might force a smile, but his body betrays stiffness. He overcompensates, laughing too loudly, asserting dominance in clumsy ways, dropping hints about his status or achievements. Or he withdraws entirely, leaving her to handle the interaction. Freud would see this as the eruption of the castration complex in symbolic form. The man feels diminished in status because he is forced to acknowledge that her sexual choice is extended to another. The unconscious reads this as a loss of unique value, which triggers defensive posturing. The woman senses the shift immediately, even if she cannot articulate it. She feels the fragile thread of his composure, and in that fragility, a small piece of respect erodes. The power response is rooted in presence. You remain physically and emotionally grounded, keeping your voice steady and your body relaxed. You greet the man with the same confident ease you would extend to anyone. If she engages him in conversation, you participate without tension, asking questions, exchanging stories, perhaps even playfully teasing her in front of him, in a way that asserts your current claim without hostility. You never once signal that this man's history with her diminishes your place in her present. In fact, you act as though you are the one who sets the tone for the interaction, because you are. Freud would interpret this as the successful integration of reality into the self-concept. Rather than defending against the discomfort through aggression or withdrawal, you absorb it and use it to reaffirm your self-image. This is sublimation in action, not suppressing the primal sting, but converting it into a display of composure that elevates you in both her eyes and his. The sub-communication here is lethal in its elegance. I know you were once in her life, but she is with me now, and that is not a coincidence. The shift in her perception after such a response is profound. First, there is relief. She does not have to manage her emotions in the presence of her past. Second, there is admiration. You have demonstrated that you are not threatened by the reality of her experiences. And third, there is deepened desire, because your calm dominance in the face of a potential ego wound signals the very security she unconsciously tests for. She will feel more anchored to you, sensing that your grip on reality is firm enough to weather the storms of truth without flinching. Scenario 4. The brutal honesty conversation. You are lying together after an intense night, the room dim, her skin warm against yours. She turns to you and says, "I want to be completely honest with you," and begins recounting aspects of her sexual past in more detail than you expected. She tells you numbers, types of experiences, things she has done. There is no malice in her tone, only transparency. But with each revelation, you feel your chest tighten. The images start to form again, vivid, uninvited. This is not a slip of the tongue or an accident. This is a conscious act of disclosure, and in Freud's terms, it is also a revelation of unconscious drives. On the surface, it may be about building trust through honesty, but beneath it, there is an element of testing, measuring whether you can hold the weight of her truth without retreating into judgment or insecurity. The psychological purpose is clear. She is showing you the full, unvarnished reality to see if you can integrate it into your image of her without fracturing your attraction or respect. The weak response is predictable. He listens with a forced smile, but internally, the tallying begins. His mind starts counting, comparing, creating a hierarchy of past lovers. He may grow colder in the following days, unable to unsee the mental images. Perhaps he subtly punishes her with distance or moralizes her experiences, signaling that her sexual past has lowered her value in his eyes. Freud would interpret this as the triumph of repression over reality. The man cannot integrate the truth into his psychic structure, so he pushes it into a mental shadow where it festers and leaks out as resentment. This erodes intimacy from the inside out. The power response requires a higher tolerance for truth. You listen fully, without interrupting, your face relaxed, your breathing even. You do not dismiss or moralize. When she finishes, you hold her gaze and acknowledge what she has shared, perhaps with a simple, "Thank you for telling me." You then pivot toward the present, subtly recentering the frame. Whatever came before brought you here. That's what matters to me. Freud would see in this response the transcendence of the ego's need for exclusivity, a willingness to accept that the self's value is not diminished by the existence of others in the partner's history. The shift in her perception is transformative. She feels she has shown you the rawest truth she can offer, and you have not only withstood it, you have remained unmoved in your desire for her. This deepens her emotional bond and increases her respect. She knows she can bring her full self into your presence without fear of destabilizing you. which is one of the rarest forms of security she will ever encounter. Scenario 5. The weaponized comparison. The room is tense. You are in the middle of an argument, not about her past, but about something entirely different. Her voice is sharp, yours is firm. The air between you electric with friction. And then she says it, not subtly, not accidentally, but as a blade. At least he knew how to. Followed by some detail from her sexual past. Or perhaps, you're not the only man who's. Followed by something she knows will burn. She does not say it because it is true in some objective sense. She says it because she wants to pierce your frame, to see if she can collapse your composure when the stakes are high. Freud would recognize this instantly as the eruption of the ID in conflict. The civilized self, the superego, has stepped aside for a moment, and the raw, primal drives have taken the stage. She is no longer just arguing. She is testing your psychic armor at its most vulnerable point, your sense of sexual primacy. This is not just about the content of her words. It is about the unconscious logic. If she can destabilize your sexual confidence, she can throw you off balance in every other area. The psychological purpose is to see if your dominance is conditional, if it only exists in peace, or if it can withstand the full blast of emotional war. The weak male response is predictable and disastrous. He snaps. He raises his voice, maybe even shouts. He hurls back insults, perhaps trying to match her blow with one of his own. Or worse, he freezes, staring at her in stunned silence, the hurt radiating off him. The argument derails entirely into a spiral about her sexual past, a subject that will never lead to resolution, only deeper resentment. Freud would interpret this collapse as the exposure of a fragile ego, with a man's sense of self-worth is so entangled with the illusion of sexual exclusivity that an attack on it unravels his composure entirely. Once she has seen this, she cannot unsee it. The knowledge that she can push this button and get an explosive reaction will live in her unconscious forever. The power response is counterintuitive. You absorb the blow. The words hit, but they do not detonate. You meet her gaze steadily, without rushing to respond. Perhaps you even allow the faintest smirk to play on your lips, not the smirk of mockery, but of a man who has just been offered bait and has no intention of taking it. When you do speak, your tone is calm, low, deliberate. You're going to have to do better than that. And then you bring the conversation back to the original point of conflict, refusing to let her diversion take root. This is more than just self-control. It is psychological dominance at the highest level. Freud would see it as the victory of the integrated self over the primitive ego wound. You are demonstrating that you are not owned by your sexual pride, and that no invocation of the past can shift you from the present frame. This is the final stage of mastery, where the primal fear that once owned you has been fully defanged. The shift in her perception after this is seismic. The immediate reaction is confusion. She expected a reaction, and the absence of it leaves her without a weapon. Beneath that confusion is a resurgence of respect. She has just thrown her sharpest spear, and you not only caught it, you set it aside as if it were nothing. In the long term, this interaction changes the way she sees you in conflict. You are no longer simply a man she is dating. You are the immovable presence against which the storms of her emotions can break without ever eroding your foundation. That is rare, and it is addictive. From these 5 scenarios, the power responses condense into a simple but devastatingly effective arsenal. 1. Unshakable presence. No flinching, no collapse, no defensive overcompensation when the past is revealed. 2. Present-centered frame. Always pivot the energy back to the now, where your dominance lives. 3. Selective engagement. Never interrogate about the past unless it serves a larger purpose. Curiosity is controlled, not compulsive. 4. Sublimation over suppression. Channel the primal sting into calm. Anchored behavior rather than burying it under resentment. 5. Conflict immunity. In the heat of argument, refuse to let her weaponize the past to destabilize you. These are not tricks. They are the visible expressions of an inner transformation, the dismantling of the fantasy of sexual exclusivity as a condition for masculine worth. Freud's insight is that the primal fear you feel when faced with a woman's sexual past is not weakness. It is an unexamined instinct. Once examined, understood, and integrated, it becomes a source of psychological sovereignty. In mastering this, you become the man who cannot be dethroned by the truth. And in a world where most men crumble when faced with that truth, your presence becomes magnetic, dangerous, unforgettable. The next step is obvious. If this primal fear can be transformed into power, then so can the other deep, unspoken insecurities that rule most men from the shadows. In our next session, we will dissect one of the most corrosive of these, the hidden compulsion to seek a woman as constant validation, and how to kill it before it kills your frame.